Donald Trump will try to reach a ceasefire in Ukraine as soon as possible. According to the Reuters, we have new nominations and a new White House, new administration will start begin its work next year. What is your prediction about Trump's willingness and Trump's ability to reach a ceasefire in Ukraine, taking into account Putin's position, because Kremlin denies the possibility of a ceasefire right now? What is your take on that?
Yes, Donald Trump has said for many months now that he can bring the Ukraine war to an end in 24 hours. And of course, if one side surrenders, all wars finish in 24 hours. I mean, if he's talking about that, he's talking about surrender. And I know that Kiev is not going to do that, whatever the United States may or may not do. The best indication we have is the paper that Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleitz wrote in April of this year. Now, Keith Kellogg has been appointed as Trump's envoy to Ukraine and Russia. And Keith Kellogg is a very impressive figure with a good military record behind him, and he's given some thinking, he's given some thought to the situation in Ukraine from America's perspective. And his paper in April was quite interesting. Most of it was an attack on the Biden administration because it was a Republican paper that was intended to highlight what the Republicans see as Biden's weaknesses. But at the end of the paper, he and Fred Fleitz, his co-author, laid out their roadmap to a settlement over Ukraine. And that roadmap was something of the order of freezing a ceasefire along the present lines of conflict, which would mean that Ukraine would not have access to about 20% of its territory. But that freeze would not imply a legal commitment. It would not be a peace deal. It would simply be a truce. And Ukraine would not be expected to give up its sovereignty of its own territory, including Crimea, because all that is territory that Ukraine is legally it's all legally part of Ukraine and has been since 1991. So there'd be a freeze along the front lines. There would, in his view, be more aid to Ukraine so that it could build up its military. There would be economic reconstruction for Ukraine derived from Russian assets, frozen assets. And there would have to be some sort of international force to police a demilitarized zone. And of course, that's easy to say and very difficult to do. But, you know, we could talk about ways in which that might occur in the best of all worlds. The thing that is interesting that lies behind the Kellogg paper is this understanding that Putin is almost certainly inclined to overplay his hand. Putin will pretend that he's got no interest in this sort of deal, but he may have to be brought to the table from an American perspective by increased pressure. So it's not impossible that despite everything that President Trump has said, that when he comes into office on the 20th of January, he will very quickly take up a stance of increasing aid to Ukraine, of increasing sanctions on Russia, in order to get Putin to a negotiating table around some sort of deal of the sort that Kellogg has laid out. Now, I don't know if that would be acceptable to Ukraine. I've no idea. But insofar as we can tell what direction the Trump administration is going, this seems to be the direction of a plan of the sort that Kellogg laid out last April, with pressure on both Kiev and Moscow to come to the table. And Moscow may have to be pressured more than Kiev to negotiate along these sort of lines. And if Kellogg is advising, then I think he would advise an incoming President Trump to be prepared to increase pressure on Russia and supply more aid, military aid to Ukraine in order to even up the stakes a little bit.
Can you imagine a scenario in which Vladimir Putin agrees to deployment of NATO troops to a demilitarized zone in Ukraine? Can you imagine such scenario?
No, I don't think it would be a sensible thing to do, to have NATO in some sense occupying a demilitarized zone. I don't think any Russian leader would agree to that willingly. However, European troops on a bilateral basis could conceivably occupy a demilitarized zone, not acting under NATO, but acting on as part of an agreement, say, with the United Nations, to be part of a group. Other troops which are not European troops might also be involved. I mean, this is not easy, because whenever we think about a demilitarized zone that would be 1,000 kilometers long, that is already a huge problem. But if some sort of negotiated truce, and I stress this is not a peace deal, it would be a temporary truce. But if some sort of negotiated truce is possible, then somebody has to come up with an arrangement that can guarantee security along 1,000 miles of demilitarized zone. So it will not be easy, but that has to be a part of any sort of ceasefire sometime during the early part of next year.
What are the other options for the Western leaders except deploying troops to Ukraine? How do you see another options for security guarantees for Ukraine without, for example, deploying European troops?
Well, I think the other options would be an air policed zone. So it's possible to try to police a demilitarized zone with air power, using drones and remote sensors. I mean, technologically, that is feasible. But then if the zone were impeded, if there is some breach in that zone, if one side or the other moved into the zone illegally, then there has to be some sort of enforcement mechanism. So again, you're still back at the idea that somebody, not NATO, but some competent military force has to be available to actually police a zone, even if there were some sort of surveillance that is remote. So you're still back at the old problem that this is a very difficult negotiation to try to make real. And I'm not going to hold my breath on this one. I'm interested to explore the possibilities, because we seem to be zeroing in gradually on the idea that there will be some sort of ceasefire sometime in 2025. But it's also entirely possible to me that the mechanics of a ceasefire will prove impossible to negotiate, and that the war may carry on in the way that it has been going in 23-24. And if I have to say, I mean, if Ukraine is able to keep going during next year, then life gets much more difficult for Russia the following year. If you look at the Russian economy, look at the problems of the strain on Russia, that if Ukraine can somehow stay in the fight meaningfully, and that's easier said than done, I absolutely understand that. But if Ukraine can stay in the fight for longer, then Russia will have its own problems to deal with in the second half of next year and in 2026.
How do you see these Russian problems in the future, and could they really change the course of this war? Do you expect Russian economy to crumble, as well as the defense, industrial sectors, and their army morale, and also their losses in military personnel and in military equipment?
Yeah, the Russian economy is facing the realities of a longer war now. And so we know that the consumer economy is suffering. The inflation officially the inflation rate is 9%, but nobody believes that. We all know that in food inflation is above 20% in Russia. And so the real inflation rate is somewhere around 20%. Interest rates, formal interest rates, are around 20%. Growth for the next year is between half of 1% in GDP to maybe 1.5% of GDP. Initially, with the stimulus provided by war production, Russia's economy grew by about 3% in 23-24. And that was a surprise to the International Monetary Fund. It was higher than they expected, but it's going down very steeply now. In addition, if the oil price drops, and you can never predict the oil price, but there is good reason to believe that it is uniquely high at the moment and may start to drift down further. So the oil price, last time I looked, was about $70 a barrel. If it slips below 60, which is entirely possible, then the Russian economy will be in some trouble. In addition, Russia is using up its own strategic reserves. Half of them, over $300 billion, are frozen in the West, and they certainly aren't going to be unfrozen. The other half of its strategic reserves, it's running down quite quickly. And Russia is completely dependent to keep this war going at the present tempo on aid, military aid from Iran and North Korea and dual-use components from China. So it's very dependent upon these other powers that are prepared to prop it up during the war. And both Iran and North Korea may find themselves in very difficult situations towards the end of next year for different reasons. So the Russian economy is not looking very good as it enters into this third, fourth year of the war, in which welfare spending, education spending is going right down. And a lot of people in Russia are now really suffering. And if you look at the opinion polls in Russia, as far as we can ascertain them, from those people who I think are in a good position to feel the mood, and the sense is that there is a strong pro-war minority, there is a strong anti-war minority, and the majority in the center do not quite know what they think. They just want the war to stop. And that's not surprising. So Russian public opinion is not fully in favor of this war. Russian public opinion is very worried about what will follow. And sanctions, if the war goes on, Russians can evade sanctions. They did quite successfully in evading sanctions, but the sanctions still have an effect. And the Russian economy is still suffering from sanctions and will suffer from more sanctions, particularly if Putin seems to turn away from a negotiated truce, which is being offered to him. Then sanctions almost certainly will increase. So in general, I think the Russian economy may be in big trouble by early 2025. Would that stop Putin? No, it won't. But it will affect the elite around him. It will affect the public mood, and it will make it even more difficult to keep on recruiting troops into his armed forces. Already, we know that they are losing about 1,500 troops a day to death and serious injury, and they're recruiting far less than 1,000 troops a day, even with very high rates of pay to attract them. So Russia's manpower problems are similar to Ukraine's manpower problems. Obviously, Russia has more manpower to call on, but they are also struggling to maintain a war that requires 400,000 Russians inside Ukraine at any one time.
Do you expect Putin's inner circle and Russian elites to put pressure on Vladimir Putin to come to the negotiations table and end this war, or to at least reach a ceasefire? And do you expect such pressure to rise as Russia continues its war against Ukraine?
I don't know if that pressure from the elites and the oligarchs around Putin will apply immediately in 2025. But if there is no sort of negotiated truce and Putin overplays his hand, if he's determined to keep on grinding away to make these marginal gains inside Ukraine, then I do believe that during the course of next year, pressure will build up on him because of the price that Russia is paying to fight this war at all. And I think that that price will go on increasing during the year. It'll become much more evident how much Russia is losing to fight this war, how much it's costing to fight the war. So I think that as the year goes on, if Russia does not agree some sort of ceasefire, I think Putin will come under greater pressure from the people around him.
Let's also cover the situation in Syria. It seems like Vladimir Putin is losing all on multiplied fronts, also in Syria, because according to Reuters, Syrian rebels have encircled the city of Hama, and they are on their way to even Damascus. From your perspective, how can this military disaster of Assad army influence Russian positions on the Middle East and in Syria? Because we have already seen reports about the withdrawal of Russian Navy fleet from Syrian bases and the withdrawal of Russian commanders, Russian air assets from the air bases in Syria.
Yeah, the Russians, we know, had already moved a lot of aircraft from Latakia, which is the air base. They'd also taken 1,000 troops away to go to Ukraine. And now we're pretty sure that they've moved most of their ships from Tartus, which is the naval base. So the Russians have taken away a lot of the forces to keep them safe. And if the rebels in Syria move on from Hama to take Homs, which it looks as if they may, then Russian forces will be completely cut off. Those that are there will be cut off from Damascus. So they won't either be able to help Assad directly, nor be supported from anywhere other than by the sea. So that will be a logistical problem. But more than that, if Assad is going to fight this war successfully, sorry, let me say that again.
Sure.
More importantly, the Russians will find it very difficult to help Assad win this war if it only relies on air power. The Russians can fly more missions to bomb civilians, as they do, and to try to bomb the rebel forces, but they won't stop a rebel advance only from the air unless they're prepared to put troops on the ground. And I don't think they are. And increasingly, it will be difficult for them to get troops there if the rebels take Homs. So I think there is a very high possibility now. I would only put it, it's not a certainty, but there is a high possibility that Assad will be removed. He will fall in the next couple of weeks. And Russia will find that its position in Syria is completely undermined. That will be a big problem for Putin. Alternatively, if he wants to divert forces from Ukraine to Syria to keep Assad in power, I imagine people in Kiev would be quite happy to see that. Either way, the Syrian crisis is a real problem for Putin, as is the Georgia crisis. And if it is the case that so many of the cards on the table, the cards that he plays in this game that he plays around the fringes of his own country, that if those cards are now not winning him any money, if the thing is turning against him, then it actually builds up pressure on him to rethink his whole strategy.
Does this also can put more pressure from the people around him who believed and who have had a belief that Vladimir Putin is the greatest diplomat and military strategist and the greatest leaders of all times?
Yeah, I mean, Putin pretends to be a strategic genius, and those of us in the West think that he is a strategic blunderer because he's a good tactician. We often say he's not a chess player because he's not clever enough to be a chess player, and he doesn't think ahead far enough. But he's a very good poker player. He's a good poker player because he spots the weaknesses in his opponent and he exploits those weaknesses. And he has the risk-taking instincts of a poker player who takes risks and plays on other people's vulnerabilities. And the point is that if you play such a complex game as he has tried to play now for well over 10 years, or 15, 18 years now, really, since he started to play these strategic games, eventually they will go wrong on you. They will turn against you because they're not based on a good, clear, strategic analysis of your situation and your national security requirements. So he's leading Russia into strategic blunder after strategic blunder. And eventually they will start to go wrong on you together, coincidentally. So he's committed now in the Sahel. He's committed in different parts of Africa. He's committed in the Middle East. And he's fighting this dreadful war in Ukraine and creating a bigger, stronger NATO as a result of everything he's done in Ukraine. As and when the wheel turns, as it always will, his reputation as a great strategist will collapse. Now, what effect that has on the people around him, we don't know, because he has pursued this sense of strategic genius with being more repressive than Joseph Stalin ever was. And so whether he's sufficiently in control of Russian society and the Russian elites, we don't know. He's running a sort of medieval court in the Kremlin, and every medieval court can function for a long time, but when it comes to an end, it normally finishes very quickly.
And our last topic would be about the situation in the South Korea. There's lots of news, and it seems like there was a try for a military coup by announcing this martial law. President Yoon Suk-yeol just tried to organize a military coup against opposition, against political leaders in his country. What is your assessment of the situation there and its influence on the region worldwide? And how can North Korea exploit the situation right now?
The incompetent behavior of President Yoon Suk-yeol on Tuesday was fairly astonishing because it was so badly planned and thought out. He got himself into a difficult position personally within the presidency. He tried to make a dramatic gesture to get out of it, and he did it so badly. And what was interesting is that the National Assembly reacts in the way that national assemblies throughout history have tended to react to situations like this. They lock themselves in and stay in session, and they therefore represent an alternative avenue of legitimacy to express the people's will. And that's what they did. And he had to back off after a number of hours. And now he's on the verge of impeachment. I think the vote to impeach him will be taken on Saturday. I'm fairly sure it will go through, and he will be impeached. I suspect he will, like a number of South Korean presidents, actually, I think he will end up in prison. At least 5 of them, I think 6 of them have been imprisoned at one time or another. And I think he will be the 7th, probably, who will end up in prison. The coup itself, the attempted coup, was all over quite quickly. It lasted less than 24 hours. And in a way, it reaffirmed the democratic principles of South Korea. There hasn't really been a non-democratic government in South Korea now since 1980. It had a very troubled past before that. But since 1980, for the last 40 years, more than 40 years, South Korea has been a vibrant, strong, prosperous democracy. And so in its own distinctive way, South Korea is a testament to the importance of Western liberal democracy. And the fact that that democracy has reasserted itself very quickly during this week is a source of strength. The North Koreans, of course, will make a lot out of it. They will make as much propaganda out of it as they can. But I think the rest of the world will see that South Korea has a stronger democracy than even one powerful president can undermine. And in that respect, although it's been a rocky ride, I think this has been one of the rare good news weeks for democracy. We haven't had many of those in the last couple of years, but this week is a good news week.
Thank you, Professor Clark, for your time and for supporting Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Yeah, glory to Ukraine. I wish you well. I wish you all well.